Hey, y'all. So we are in our final lecture here. We've talked about the age of anxiety. I pointed out philosophies. I pointed out physics. I pointed out Christianity, and we kind of we're just getting. I hope you have this general feel that the intellectual world, what it was once based on truth, is now completely turned upside down. And now we're going to delve into Freudian psychology, and this is a new understanding of the individual. Freud is going to base his ideas on us as animals, instinctive animals. This is going to add to that anxiety as we dive into reconnect with Darwinian science, evolutionary traits, these different elements. But it's going to be from the mind point of view. And Sigmund Freud here, he introduced his ideas in 1899 with the interpretation of dreams. He argued that human behavior was irrational, governed by the unconsciousness. He believed the unconscious influenced human behavior, but the unconsciousness is unknowable. And that is really because we have to be the only way we gain a better understanding is through psychotherapy. And we're going to see that in a second. He identified really there's three structures of self. And the three structures, I really like this image. The first thing we see is the id. The id is the animal instincts. It's the sinfulness. It's the aggressive pleasure seeking in pleasure. Sometimes we call this the pleasure principle, in which the id really wants to get out there and really do what it wants to do. That's your animal nature. Well, the second part of it is the superego. The superego is that morality. And I think about this time, I think of propriety, right? Think about that Victorian propriety that we've talked about, the right way to do things. Think about how genders were defined, how sexuality was defined. Think about the social mores, about what we should do and not do. Everything was under this confine. We have this Judeo Christian worldview. And the superego is this idea in which these are the rules and regulations that control life. And then the ego, that's your seat of reason, your consciousness. You have an understanding of the ego. Now, I want to point out the ego I would argue the ego is like the Overton window to your soul. And the radical far left is your id. It wants to go buck wild. But your superego is that reactionary right. It's saying, no, 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 that's sinful. You're not supposed to do that. And your ego is battling in between. What should I do? Should I or should I not? And your ego is constantly being bombarded by the id and superego. But it's in the middle, hopefully. And in that sense, so again, I would argue the ego is more like that Overton window, and it is under the fight of the id and superego. And neurosis, neurosis is that mental illness that Sigmund Freud identified, and he believed the only way you can truly overcome mental illness was through psychoanalysis. The talking through, right? The talking through, the talking cure. And in this sense, the person has to talk about their deepest thoughts, and then the psychiatrist can help field questions to ferret out these elements. And and he wasn't there to judge, but again, in this idea, if someone was too far into the id, he would argue, he would try to bring up the ideals of the superego. Because if you're too far into the id, you might be a serial murderer. You might be someone who you don't want to be around because you're uncontrollable. So you need that. You need a little bit more of that morality. He would poke that side. But if you were a prude or one who just lived within propriety, he might poke a little bit at the id to force that window, your Overton window, more to the center. because he believed life, you're there's a lot of suppression that we have could be, and he really focused on sexual suppression. And if you think about the age, the Victorian values during this age, think about the id, sexuality, that was really being controlled, and he believed that was the root of so much of the ills. But once again, we see that Sigmund Freud, really the father of psychology, introduces the ideas of psychotherapy. He believed that the unconsciousness was dictated by the three parts of the id, superego, and ego. Remember that ego is that Overton window. And what we're going to see now, we're going to conclude the intellectual revolution and this age of anxiety. The philosophy of this age attempted to find meaning in the meaningless of war and economic depression. It challenged the idea of progress because of what was seen. Christianity reemerged as a hope for the masses. The new physics, and that's that second physics revolution followed by the heroic age of physics, really illustrated the limitations of Newtonian physics and said, no, there's reality past that. Now, connect those two things, right? Connect the philosophy, the irrational, to physics. All of a sudden, irrationalism has scientific value. We have to push beyond the accepted truths. Really interesting stuff. And then lastly, the Freudian psychology challenged the way human behavior was understood. No longer was it understood in a Christian mindset. It is now going to be talked about the idea of the unconsciousness, the id, the superego, and these different elements. But all in all, I'm hoping that I've done an okay job to show you that everything was turned upside down. What was once true is no longer true. In our next lecture, we'll illustrate how this was demonstrated in the arts and the cultural realms. I hope you have a great day. I hope this made sense. I will definitely field questions later.